Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, welcoming you to our second member conversation in a new series called SAR Impacts.
In an effort to help you stay connected and feel part of our community during this time of social distancing, we're offering this exciting new initiative to our members that will feature online video interviews, conversations with leading scholars and artists. Our goal with this series is to maintain a more personal relationship with you, our members, and the many voices that represent SAR. This month's conversation features Northern Chumash artist Leah Mata Fragua, who uses her art to explore the effects of climate change on our environment and the importance of place-based arts. We're grateful to the Pelahema Foundation for providing the generous support for this series, and we also want to thank our members whose contributions to SAR make much of this possible. Before I introduce Leah, a few housekeeping items. Some of you are familiar with these from previous webinars, so forgive me for repeating. The way you ask questions. There are two ways to submit your questions. By the way, this is a dialogue, so after some initial material and a presentation by Leah, we'll be open to questions. You can type your questions in the question box, which you'll see in the webinar menu, typically to the right of your screen. I'll act as moderator and try my best to get to all these questions. Another option, if you have a microphone on your computer, is to raise your hand electronically. And again, in the webinar menu to the right, you'll see next to your name a little hand, and you would click that, and our webinar coordinator, Lindsay Archuleta, will do her best to call on you and allow you to ask your questions through your microphone. Leah Mata Fragua is a Northern Chumash artist, and she's this year's Eric and Barbara Dobkin Artist Fellow. She's a practitioner of place-based traditional arts, and she uses her art to spread awareness about the devastating effects of climate change on her people in the Pacific Coast. She's witnessed environmental degradation, you may hear about that, which has diminished the resources that she and other coastal indigenous people use to maintain their traditional arts and their diet and other aspects of their life. Her work brings attention to the intersection between traditional arts and climate change with the hope of inspiring action. We'll start with a brief pre-recorded video profile of Leah Mata Fragua, and then I'll do a handoff to Leah.
We separate sometimes indigenous art from regular art or whatnot, but really we're all in this together. Even though my work comes from my community, I think that it can speak to people outside of my community. My name is Leah Mata Fragua, and I am an artist fellow at SAR. My mom is Chumash from Central Coast, California. I learned the values of my tribal community through my mom and my grandmas and relatives, and the way that I gather, the way that I use materials. You'll see a lot of my work. I do use everything. So it's the values, the traditional values that my mom had that play a huge role in my artistic practice. My work is place-based. It comes from my homeland. There are materials that have been used for thousands of years, and I continue to use them, just I might use them a little bit differently now. The project I'm doing for SAR will be a full-size dance dress with the intent that it's going to be not danced in, but used as a opportunity or a platform to talk about the lack of access to materials and how climate change is affecting my community. Our dresses are completely made with natural materials from our environment. What better way to tell that story than through a dress? Sometimes there's this perception that indigenous people can only make primitive work, and if we do make pop art or more contemporary pieces of work, that's not indigenous or that doesn't fit in the box. However, with climate change, when you're materials are impacted, you have to start thinking about how you're going to continue to do those things. And I think where I'm from, it needs to be a collective community dialogue. I think everyone and everything is a teacher. You just have to listen and hear it. Find those paths that help sustain our traditions, our practices, our foods, our resources, our languages. Because really, when it comes down to it, being able to sustain those regardless of what happens externally is the important part of the survival of Indigenous people. And I hope that my work speaks to other generations, and that, you know, long after I'm gone, that it'll still be an important conversation.
Hi, Leah.
Hello.
You're a tiny bit out of focus.
Oh, I don't know. It's a new computer. How about that?
Okay. So welcome, and could you start by just telling us a little bit about your background and your project at SAR and anything else that you want to start with?
Yeah, so my name is Leah Mata Fragua, and I am Titu Northern Chumash from San Luis Obispo County area, which is on the central coast of California. And the project I'm doing for SAR is a dance dress that will reflect kind of the current environmental impacts that we're seeing, at least in my area or throughout California. Normally our dresses we use to dance in, but this one won't be danced in. This is going to be used more as a conversation or a dialogue piece to bring awareness. There are coastal people throughout the world and in the US that are currently being relocated or heavily impacted by climate change. Most of those people live in coastal areas. And so we're kind of on the front lines of seeing climate change. I think if you're inland or you're in an urban area or you don't interact with your environment, you may be kind of missing the signs that are telling us that it's coming. So I wanted to kind of bring that dialogue or that narrative into my work, and so I really wanted to create a dress that represented that. A lot of people will say, well, why do you use a dress? And I use our dance dresses, one, because that's kind of where I started making or creating was dance dresses. And then the dresses that we have are pre-contact dresses. They're made entirely from materials from our bioregion. And so what better way to tell that story about cultural resources through a dress that only uses cultural resources. So I'm hoping to engage other artists to look at their practices, whether they're place-based artists or not, and think about the materials that they use and where those materials come from, and how sometimes the materials we use are being impacted, and how do we replace or exchange those materials. So that's kind of what I'm trying to capture and the dialogue that I'm trying to capture. And so hopefully today people will walk away with a little bit better understanding of not only my community or Indigenous people in California, but also kind of looking at their carbon footprint in the art that they make.
That's great. For those of us who are not Californians, Leah, could you just give us a little background on the Northern Chumash? How many are there? Do you live in one community or separated in multiple places?
So California is incredibly complex, and it would take a couple webinars to explain the Indigenous California. In a nutshell, a quick kind of overview is often people think that there aren't California Indians. There are plenty of California Indians. At one point, California was the most linguistically diverse place in the world. And that has all changed since contact. We had several different waves of contact, starting with the missions, going to the Mexican period, to the American period, and gold rush. So we had several waves of colonization, and often those included genocide of a lot of tribes that are completely extinct to this day. So we tend to, and also in California, we don't have treaty rights. They were lost somehow. So we kind of all had to negotiate independently. So different tribes have different negotiations. We also have a rancheria system. We also have state recognized systems. So we have a lot of different layers, which makes it complex. Most Californians, because land is so valuable in California, don't have large land bases, if at all. More rural areas of California seems to have larger land bases, but some communities can be only a couple acres. So it just depends on where in California a tribe is located. My community is in Central Coast, or what's considered Central Coast. There are several different Chumash languages. The word Chumash is something that anthropologists kind of gave our linguistic group, but there are several different languages, and within those languages there are different dialects. Wow. And those are all different communities. I know people just say Chumash, or they say Pomo, or they may say Luceño, but those are all tiny different, those are just major headings. There's lots of communities underneath those. And many of our communities are going back to our traditional names or our pre-contact names. So it's always important to understand the complexities of Indigenous California, because it's often misunderstood. And I'm excited because we don't really leave California that much to showcase our work or talk about our community. So it's kind of nice to have this opportunity to bring it to a different audience.
Yeah. Do you want to say something about what drew you to this form of art as opposed to more conventional, two-dimensional paintings and that sort of thing?
I'm technically not a trained artist. I didn't go to art school. I'm taught through relatives and friends my process. So it wasn't something that I saw on a college, application or an art school application. I'm not a fine artist, or don't consider myself one. And so, I don't know, it's a weird label to wear sometimes, because I didn't come from saying I wanted to go to art school or going to an art school or design school. This is something that I grew up with.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you intend to do with the project that you've been working on at SAR? I gather you don't expect that it will be danced. So is it really something that you're using as a model? You're modeling it for other people in your community?
Other people in my community, usually my work or my dresses that have kind of a larger narrative to them usually travel to museums. Some are purchased for private collections, or they're museum acquisitions for exhibits. So I imagine seeing it travel. That's my goal. I'll probably come back after COVID and have it photographed. Things are weird right now with scheduling and interacting with people. So after COVID, I'll have it photographed and probably display it on social media as well with a narrative.
Yeah, things are weird is the understatement of all time. And just our members should know that both you and Dorothy Grant, we have these two terrific artists on campus, and you've been essentially quarantined. We've been closed as an institution. People are working from home, and I've said this to you and Dorothy before. I apologize. This isn't the normal run of things at SAR, and under normal circumstances, you would have been reeled into all kinds of activities on campus and met a lot of our members in person. They would have been delighted to meet you, but that wasn't the way it turned out. And I have to say, you've been wonderfully cheerful and good-natured and upbeat about the whole thing, and we're grateful for that. And we want you to come back someday when things are normal.
Yeah, I'll come back when it's normal.
We all want normal back. So I understand you had another video clipping that you wanted to show us? Do you want to go to that now, or do you want to talk about something else first?
No, I wanted to go to it because I think it will prompt people to ask questions, and it really transports people visually to the things that I'm discussing today. So yeah, if we could roll the video and then we can do some questions or answers. The video really gives people an idea of the area I'm talking about and the community and materials and the process.
Okay, so I'm going to mute my video, and Lindsay will maybe a bit of a pause before the video starts to go. That was great, thank you. We don't get the ocean here in New Mexico, so it's always a pleasure to see the Pacific, even if it's only on video. Do you want to talk a little bit about where you are in the process of this particular project right now? I mean, what you've been spending most of your time working on, and how you work with the materials and obtain the materials?
So in the video, you saw a lot of people gathering and collecting. One thing I love about our dance dresses is, and this is often common throughout California, our dresses are very similar up and down the coastal areas and even inland. To someone who's not from California, they may look all the same, but for someone from California, we can tell kind of what tribal community those dresses come from because of the materials they use and how they're used. So there's distinct little differences. Maybe up north it's maple bark, and in my area it's willow and cottonwood. So, but they're bark skirts, and so they look similar, but they're different from people from California. We can see that difference. What I've been mostly working on is the bark skirt, and there was a picture of it, and oh, wrong way. And I've mostly been working on the bark skirt, which is, I can tell it's a little bit dark to see it, but I've been working on the bark skirt and shell work, dance belts that go with the dress. And the dress, you can't see it here, but in the video, the bark skirt with the blue on the bottom, that is used, that's natural ochre that's been mixed to create a blue. And that's to really represent that ocean level rising. For those of us on the coast, we're seeing it. We have these things now called king tide. Well, we had king tides, but the king tides that are happening now are coming into urban areas that are along the coast. So if there's a king tide and you parked your car in a parking lot that happens to flood, you'll come out to your car flooded. And those things didn't happen when I was younger. So there's these slight indicators, and because it doesn't happen quickly, it's incremental. It's unless you've had a relationship to that place or been in that place for a long time, you're not seeing those incremental differences. And so it's difficult if you just move to the area, and that's normal. And the other thing that is making it difficult kind of to get materials is our ecosystem's really out of balance, and especially the ocean. And so there's this chain of events that are happening that are killing off our resources. And because it's underwater, people aren't seeing it, so it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But when we are no longer able to access our materials, some of them are on the endangered species list. You know, I never thought in my lifetime things that were so plentiful would be in a few short years on the endangered species list. And it's unfortunate, you know, and it was difficult enough getting materials in California. And then when I moved to Jemez, it became a little more difficult and challenging to get materials. I'd have to go back home once a month. And then now with COVID, it's like another layer of difficulty. And so it's been a challenge to get materials, but you know, we all find workarounds. The original blue ochre I wanted to get somehow got lost I had ordered it from an Aboriginal company in Australia, but it got lost in international COVID mail. And so I was panicking, thinking, how am I going to, you know, complete this project without one of the things I needed most? And luckily, a couple weeks later, a local art store opened for curbside, and they had to bring out every color ochre to the curb so I could pick and choose and mix the colors I needed. It's been an adventure. Like you said, you know, we've been isolated up here. I didn't know Dorothy before this, but now we know each other very well. Just being the only two, you know, artists here, trying to just navigate this. And you know, when this was happening early on, we were wondering, well, should we stay? Do we go? And then the communities that we have to travel to both have restrictions as well. And so we were trying to navigate that. And then I just figured, well, there's not much I can do other than just try and keep working. And so that's kind of what I've done, is just keep working. I was planning on going to California to get my shells, but I was able to get them mailed. And that took a bit of a time, but it worked. And so I have my shells here. And these are the abalone shells that we use. And we use other shells too. These currently are the most endangered right now. There is a moratorium on getting them. So I can't get any more shells, or all of our shell workers can't get any more shells. Most of the shells we get from stockpiles from divers that have them, you know, in their garage, or through, you know, antique stores that happen to have them. Maybe they made a lamp out of them, and I'll buy the lamp and take it apart. Or you can go to a flea market in California on the coast and usually pick up some. You know, so it's difficult. And I know a lot of people say, well, how about just using those farmed abalones, the small ones? And I do, but they're not very thick. And because abalone, their reproductive cycle is a lot slower than other species, and their growth cycle is a lot slower, it takes a while for them to get to a certain thickness and size that is that you can use for a dress or pendants or jewelry. The farmed abalone tends to be a little bit thinner, so while it might be great for inlay work, it's not necessarily great for larger pieces because it's so thin it can break. So it's challenging, and you know, it's really made me as an artist think about my direction and how do I sustain what I do, and how our communities sustain what they do. And you know, I'm transitioning into different types of art or different mediums. So I'm working on smaller versions of dresses and making dolls instead of a full dance dress usually. You know, I'll have to phase out my jewelry, which is sad, because think about it, if there was no more silver or no more paint, how would those artists continue, and how would you support artists that had to transition. And what does that mean, you know, mid-career forced transition, you know? And I didn't go to art school, so it's, you know, I learn a lot from friends, family. Believe it or not, YouTube is a great teacher. So it's a journey, you know, that I'm on, and it is due to climate change.
A quick question. So you've married into Jemez Pueblo. Has being at Pueblo, of course, is famous for its own artists. Has that affected your work at all, or do you really, are you, you know, you're kind of in your own zone, your northern Chumash zone, and unaffected by what you see around you?
No, it impacts me quite a bit. I love hand sanding, so I do a lot of hand sanding of my own work, but sometimes if my mother-in-law needs pot sanded, I'll offer. I like doing a lot of tactile work. So, and then in the Jemez area, there are a lot of resources that I do use. So there's cottonwoods, lots of cottonwoods, and we make our bark skirts from cottonwood. So I've actually had two Jemez guys out there helping me, you know, collect wood or look for wood. They have deer grass and bear grass, so I'm able to get some resources here. I actually found a pile of tule going out to Gallup in a marsh area, so I'm always looking for resources. You know, if I can't get back home, which, you know, during COVID time has been unusual because I usually go back home, and I'm not going back home to collect, so it is weird, but being around other artists inspires me. So I enjoy the environment in Jemez because there's so many artists. I mean, I can walk out my front door and talk to someone about a show. Where in California, that's not true. It's very isolating in California. It's a very big state. Indigenous people are incredibly invisible. Most of our artists stay within their communities. They don't venture out, so you don't see too many California Indian artists at larger shows or doing fellowships like this. So coming here, for me, it's a lot of excitement because there are so many artists around, and I get to engage and have conversations with people where I otherwise would have been very isolated.
Sure. So we got a couple of questions that come in. Amy's she starts off with a statement. It looks pretty much like all of your work is labor intensive. So she asked, do you typically work on one project at a time, or do you have a number of projects going at any given time?
So one thing about place-based artists in California, basket weavers, regalia makers, is we tend to work almost seasonally because we have to pre-plan what we're going to make, because a lot of our materials have to be gathered at a certain time of year. And lately fire's been impacting that. So 3 summers I've had to forego gathering pine nuts in my area, and our pine nuts are not piñons. We're talking bull pine or sugar pine. They're similar but different. So yes, our work is very labor intensive. First we have to gather, and then we have to either dry or process materials before we can use them, and then we put together an item, a basket or a jewelry or dance dress. So it is incredibly labor intensive. Most people that I know make dresses, it takes years because you're collecting shell, right? You're collecting your materials seasonally, you're letting them dry, you're having to process them before you can work with them, and then you work with them. So yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into place-based work in California.
So when you have an opportunity to collect a particular item, a type of product, you're thinking of several projects that you can use it for when the opportunity arises.
Yeah.
This is sort of a naive question, but as coastal California, I mean, is privatization of land an issue in terms of your ability to access materials?
Yeah, so as well as environmental degradation, we also have a lot of other reasons why it makes cultural resources difficult to access. And yeah, privatization of a lot of land, development, national parks, state parks, county parks, regional parks, So all of that requires us to go through multi-layers of permission getting, bureaucracies. You know, we have this term in California called guerrilla gathering. I won't go too much into that, but it's for itself in the definition or the term that I'm using, because it can be cumbersome. And, you know, a lot of land that is privatized in California is leftover Spanish and Mexican land grants. So those families have still benefited from taking land from Indigenous people, and many Indigenous people just don't have access to resources. Not even, you try and develop relationships with ranchers or agricultural people, but because California Indigenous people are so invisible, they have no idea what you're talking about.
So there's a question from Donna Berg that's about the dancing. So she says, did you learn to dance as part of learning to make the dress, or are they completely discrete activities within the community? And then can you tell us a little bit about the kind of dancing you do? Are there musical instruments, drumming, is it strictly vocal? What's it like?
Yeah, so I know we have these events in California, in kind of the states kind of divided up on how they define them, but dances or gatherings can be called big times more in Northern California. And then in Southern California, we call them, they're more called fiestas. Technically, someone who's a dressmaker doesn't necessarily need to be a dancer. They can or cannot be. Some people just are makers, so they maybe just make. And dresses in communities are often passed down or shared in some ways. And in California, except for in small areas up north and kind of more towards the inland border areas, pretty much for the most part of the state, we use things called clapsticks. So we don't have drums. And I don't want to speak for all California, but predominantly in California, you'll see clapsticks. And I should have brought one, but I didn't think about it. So mostly it's singing, it's clapsticks. There are communities that have drums, but they're quite different. And I'm not from those communities, so I don't really want to share about it, but because I don't know the correct terminology. But so yeah, our dances are mostly, I mean, they're not, some are open, but mostly they're not like you would see here. Sometimes if you really want to see California Indigenous people, you can go to California Indian Day in September in our state capital, Sacramento. They do have a performance where several different tribal communities throughout California will showcase their communities. So that's always a good event if you're out in California. Some of the museums have dances or gatherings.
A couple more questions have come in. Why is abalone endangered, Paul asks, and how is that related to climate change? Or has it been over exploited, or both?
Both. So in Southern California, the moratorium started because of overfishing and overharvesting. And that moratorium in Southern California has been there for a few decades now. And then, so then you could harvest or gather with your fishing permits or licenses kind of about an hour north of Golden Gate Bridge and up. But 2 years ago, there was a moratorium on gathering abalone, and reason being is, yes, the species is in a decline. Even with the moratorium a few decades in Southern California, we're nowhere near being able to either fish or gather them anymore because the population just hasn't come back. So even after a few decades of protection, it's not working. And in Northern California, where it was allowed, the reason there is a moratorium is because, yeah, the ocean is getting warmer. And so what's happening is it's creating the ecosystem is out of balance. And so what's happening is that the starfish are not doing well in warmer climates, and so they're dying off. And then the starfish are the purple sea urchins' natural predators. And so without having a predator, the purple sea urchin population is exploding, and they reproduce and eat faster than abalone. And both purple sea urchins and abalone feed off kelp beds. So our kelp beds are really being almost deforested underneath. It's just someone went in and just mowed all the forest kelp beds down. And so what's happening is the abalone is really starving to death, and they're not thriving. And because they have a slower reproduction cycle and a slower growth cycle, it's harder for them to reproduce and survive under these conditions. And so it's just a chain of events that is happening. And we don't see it because we're not actively in the water engaging in those ecosystems.
Richard is asking a related question. It says, you mentioned fire and pine nuts and king tides as exemplifying environmental change that have an impact on collecting materials. Are there other changes that are affecting the availability of specific items that you would use? Are there other examples of the same process?
Yeah, drought right now has also impacted some of our trees. I know in my area, you're seeing a lot of trees impacted by drought. So they're dying off, and that's the trees where we get our pine nuts from. But primarily in California, those are the things that are impacting the materials that I use the most, is fire, and then the ocean conditions, so, and drought mostly.
We've got no more questions coming in. Let me just start to wrap then. First of all, let me say again how heartbreaking it's been for us to have this much Indigenous artistic talent on campus and not really have access to you other than kind of waving or talking through masks. And I'm sure our members feel the same way, because attendance at the artist talks and gallery tours is always outstanding at SAR. So we've got significant numbers here. I think we've got 37 right now with us, and your live stream talk had significantly, well, it's actually gotten a lot of traffic since it was recorded and put up. So and I think our audience is broadening. I guess I wanted to ask you, since you're in the Dubin Artist Studio, do you feel some kind of vibe from all the great Native artists who've worked in there over the years?
All these artists on the back wall. Yeah, and I actually, if there's any artists or past artists tuning in, I looked through all the books and I checked out everybody's pictures, and that was fun. I think it's great because, you know, I think you've only, in terms of artists, I know in scholars you've had other Chumash people. In terms of artists, I think you've had one other Chumash person, and that's probably the only other California person you have. So I don't know, Chumash women tend to be really outgoing, and so I know SAR's had two Chumash women scholars and 2 Chumash women artists. So I don't know, we're a very small community, so I think that says a lot for us, that, you know, we're excited about sharing our community and our work, and bringing more visibility to Chumash people.
Well, we're grateful for the work that you've done and for your willingness to talk to us this way. It's not the same as being here in person, but you'll see that I'm actually in my office at SAR today, which is a lot more attractive than my tiny home office. And I'll probably keep doing this because I just love being here, and it's and you probably feel the same way about the Dubin Studio, which has tremendous history and kind of tradition that you help to exemplify. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank all our members for joining us for this event, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Be sure to check the SAR website. We've got all kinds of events, and we'll be doing this as long as it takes, and until it's safe for us to meet face to face again. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, our members. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.